Hey YouTube, Mr. Terry here. Today marks the 20-year anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the United States. And I thought I would just kind of give you guys some unscripted thoughts, a little bit about what that day was kind of like for me. So I was in high school. I was in high school at that time. And I'll kind of recall what I kind of remember about that day. So I just woke up usually in high school, woke up about 6:30 a.m. and took a shower and all that stuff, and then I went up to my kitchen, kind of just plunked on the TV as I was getting cereal, about to leave for the day. And of course, whatever channel it had come on was, the news had popped in, and I remember just seeing this, the World Trade Center, one of the buildings, and with a big black spot towards the top and some smoke coming out. Now, I've lived across the country, and I've been to New York a few times. Used to go there as a child, and I remember going to the World Trade Center and going, visiting it and all that kind of stuff. I think even going to the top. I think we pretty sure I did when I was younger. So I had some awareness, of this, and that it was like a very important building. And I remember just kind of along the bottom of the screen, it says plane hits, World Trade Center. Okay, and originally when that kind of came up, I'm like, oh, just some pilot like accidentally flew in there. You know what I mean? And it was kind of like this dumb thing. Like, man, that just sounds really dumb. I can't believe somebody did that. And then at that time, my parents are getting up too, and I'm like, hey, come in, come look at this. And of course, there was absolutely no information about what had actually happened there, right? No information whatsoever. So we're just like, all right, I guess that's kind of stupid, just whatever. And I think I actually remember having the conversation. I'm like, you know what? I'm kind of surprised in a way that maybe amateur pilots don't like this doesn't happen more. The World Trade Center is huge. New York City is full of these huge buildings, has multiple airports, and I think I remember kind of talking about that. Anyway, I remember I don't know if I had my cereal or whatever, but I was watching the screen, and the next thing that happened changed things forever, and for how I was looking at it. Because I was watching the screen as they were talking about the first hit and they didn't really know anything, but watching the screen as boom, I watched live the second plane hit. And that is when, for everybody I know, it just clicked. It was like, this is not an accident. So then it's just like, okay, a totally turned thing. It went from this just dumb thing that had happened. That was obviously going to be devastating because I'm sure people would have died. Hopefully, if anybody died, it was just the pilots, a whole bunch of other civilian stuff. It's still tragic, of course, but it's like this is for real. Like, this is a real thing. Now, as a young high school, I don't think I really understood terrorism. I had no idea about a lot of the conflicts of the United States, in the era kind of leading up to it, and didn't understand much about, I had no idea like what Al Qaeda was, or Osama bin Laden. Hadn't known the interaction between the United States and the foreign policy that groups like Al Qaeda were protesting and things like that. But anyway, so I was very ignorant to it. I had no idea what was going on. And then I just remember, seeing that and being like, holy cow. And going to my parents, I'm like, it's suicide bombers. This has got to be suicide bombers. And I remember thinking like, why? Like, World Trade Center? You're just like, what are you doing? Like, what impact is that supposed to make? I didn't really understand what terrorism was either. To me, if it was a suicide bomber, it'd be more like this other strategic location or something, but just flown into a civilian building in New York City. Well, anyways, obviously it was kind of weird, but I didn't really process much, and still, of course, I didn't know the effects that it would have going on. Anyways, time to go to school. So go to school, and this is I think a big thing too, because my first period was kind of interesting that this specifically was my first period. I had a physics class first period, and my teacher was active military. Right, he's in the National Guard, had been in the military for years. Loved him, loved him. Big influence for one of my favorite teachers ever. Anyway, so I go in, and he's got the TV on in the room. Our school, in our school, we all had TVs. I don't know if any of you guys are older like me. I don't know if anyone knows what Channel One News was. Channel 1 News. It was a news program directed towards kids. And when I was in junior high and then into high school, they would play these news programs. So every room had a TV. Okay. So anyway, he had it on, and you could tell people were kind of talking about it and all that. I didn't necessarily know if the day would be kind of weird because I'm just like, this is an attack, whatever. It's still going to be like business as usual, right? But I could tell with my teacher. My teacher was pretty fidgety. I could tell he was kind of bouncing out of the room and going to the other teachers' rooms and going into there was like a science office next door, and he obviously he understood this was a big deal and didn't really attempt to teach us that day, and not a lot of teachers necessarily did. I'll get to that later though. But anyway, it kind of went through my mind. I could tell as this teacher I loved that was military. I could tell going through his mind was, is this something that he's going to have to get involved with? Is there going to be something like he's going to be called and sent out or something like that? Because about that time would have been about, my school started about 7:30 a.m. So we were watching it about 8 a.m. and stuff like that. You started very briefly hearing a little bit about what they thought was happening and like who this was happening from. Again, I had never heard of, when I was that age, of Al Qaeda or Osama bin Laden or anything like that. So I still didn't process it. But I can understand my teacher was very worried that this could be something he might have to be called to active duty. Anyway, I remember watching the TV and, the news reporters are talking. We're all just watching. I think some kids were more into it than others. And I was, I was just like, young kid just kind of watching it. And I remember them saying things like, oh man, these historic buildings, like they're going to have to come down, right? Like, I hope people are coming down. And they were saying like, can this building, can it withstand like the damage that was done to it? Like it was all this conjecture. And I remember saying the building's going to have to come down, right? And all this stuff. And it was, I double checked before I got on here because I wanted to make sure the timeline was right. And I believe it was at 10:30 Eastern that the building fell down, and that was when I was in this class. It was also when I was in this class of mine, and I remember watching the first tower crumble, right, live on TV. And again, I remember they were just talking about like, was this building gonna have to come down eventually? But nobody thought that this building would collapse. Like these would actually collapse because the hits, if you've seen them, are fairly high up. You know what I mean? But it collapsed, and you hear the gasps from the reporters, and of course they're saying, are the people evacuated? Like, did the people get out? You had no idea because there's thousands and thousands of people, and this was right when the day is starting to come about with New York City, and I was just thinking about like, oh my gosh, there's no way they got everybody out, right? So anyway, the building come down, and that changed a lot of things. Then we start really thinking about lives. Like, yeah, people are gonna die there. People that weren't involved in the actual like the plane itself. Anyway, I can't remember if it was during that period that the second tower came down. I got to go back and look at that timeline, but I do remember vividly that first timeline. Now, of course, by this it was a huge deal. People are talking about it in the halls. Went to my next class, and it was like my English class, and same thing. The teachers, I'd like to actually go back and talk to some of those teachers. The teacher I was just talking about in first period, I've talked this about, and he's written things down about that, and I'll come back to that teacher, by the way. But yeah, I'd like to talk to some of these other teachers because I don't remember if all the periods are like this, but I remember the period after we didn't really have much of a lesson. It was like, maybe it was like, hey, do this work that we kind of needed, but the TV was on. I remember watching it, and I forget again which period was late. I think it was a little bit later after that. Maybe I think it was right after lunch, and people are talking about, still not processing it as kids. But I remember my history teacher, who I loved. He was a huge influence to me. I already loved history, but he was one of those teachers who was like super fun and super passionate, and I've that was something I knew I wanted to strive to, because about this time in high school I knew I wanted to be a history teacher, and this was one of those teachers I loved. Anyway, he is when about that time of the day, early afternoon, where I started hearing about Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, and because I remember he was mentioning it, like, hey, they think this might have been Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. I have no idea what that was, and I don't remember if he really explained it. But that's when I started hearing that kind of name and everything. Well, anyway, the school day ended, and I remember going home and all that stuff, and more stuff is coming out. But it was later in that day that I understood that, like, this was going to be a huge thing, because immediately people were talking about that this was the next Pearl Harbor. You know what I mean? The next Pearl Harbor for the United States. It had been the biggest kind of like domestic attack since then. And then going through my head, of course, I'm like, man, think of all what the reactions were like to Pearl Harbor. The United States went to war and all this stuff. And it's almost like you started to see that stuff kind of unfold. You saw the entire country swept up in this spirit of patriotism. If you're younger watching this and you were maybe too young to remember this, maybe you weren't alive, it was something like that. It's something people talk about today that was, I guess, a proud moment in American history where the country seemed to be super unified. Like, everybody was obviously upset, and again, most people across the United States did not understand a lot of the politics around it and all that stuff. But anyways, it was a very unifying thing. People talk about how in those days after, everybody was friendly to each other and was helping each other and all this stuff. And I don't know, that might be a bit of hyperbole, but nevertheless, you had this, and everybody was glued to what President Bush was saying, and people talking about like they need to find out what was the cause of this, and have like swift military action, things that everybody was very, very much supportive of, especially in the early in that early time. But it was interesting overall, just seeing what, again, people were already telling me. I remember parents and stuff were saying, like, this is probably going to be your Pearl Harbor, right? And I don't think I knew then. I knew some things might be kind of different, but I had no idea, now looking back 20 years, that this event was going to be historical. It's going to change not just U.S. history, which it did. It changed U.S. foreign policy and that sort of thing. But it's had an impact globally, because the United States, responding in such a global manner, affects, of course, a lot of people. And back to that teacher I was telling you about real quick. So that teacher, in fact, did get called in and was going to be sent over to, I believe he went to Iraq. And again, teacher I loved, and he went over, and he was kind of right. I mean, you could see it on his face that day that he knew he was going to be part of that. He was very high up. He's a colonel, and had one of his group was one of the best at whatever it is that they did. They were at like a top unit, and went over there. And I don't exactly remember when he left, but he left during the school year, and was gone basically the rest of that year. And then he was able to come back, because I had him for a couple classes. I ended up having him as a senior, because that was before then. Having him as a senior and that kind of thing. And he, but anyways, yeah, kind of, he did in fact go over, and you could see in his face on that morning that he felt that could happen, and it definitely happened. And I'm sure a lot of you know people that may have fought or, been involved in that in some way. Now, back to the idea of, I don't think any of us knew, but foreign policy of the United States would change, and things would change in general. A lot of people say that was that time immediately after, may have been the time when the United States was the most unified as a people, as far as like support, and the next few decisions to be made in response to this were quite popular, right? There's a lot of coming together. But I've also heard a lot of people say, when you look at it in this 20 years later, is that was, from that point on, we have consistently now become more divided. And I'm talking about the American perspective. And so leading up to that, there was division and stuff. But people say, after really, the military activities start get going. I'm not going to get into specifics about that, but that kind of stuff. And eventually, over time, the disagreements started to happen in the years following that. But at that moment, in those first, whatever weeks, months, people were very unified in the United States. And then since then, it's been more and more divisive. And you'll see, I'm sure you've seen a lot of people with social media posts trying to remind people that we were once really unified. And, maybe the whole never forget thing, that maybe those are things that can unify us, if we think back to those sort of things. But then the message usually comes back is a national tragedy something that we should need to be unified as a nation, right? Is there any going back to that right post 9/11 feel of unity as Americans for that sort of thing would ever happen again? Now, there's something we got to talk about too, though, because people talk about it was the most unified time, but I've also heard people say, well, unified for who, right? This is a time also when people said the United States also increased its xenophobia, fear against foreigners, especially foreign people in or outside of the United States having any tie to, say Islam, because it came out pretty quickly that these were Islamic fundamentalists from the Al Qaeda group doing this terrorist actions, and then people started getting lumped together. You're probably also going to see on your feeds, depending on what kind of you follow, a bunch of people that were, maybe they were Muslims or something like that. Maybe not even Muslim, maybe just somebody from the region, or not even from the region, just somebody that people that don't understand history and things just lumped you in. And you're going to hear a lot of people saying, and I saw this in the last day or two, people saying, hey, that whole unified America thing, that didn't happen for everybody. That happened for a group, but there was a lot of people that were heavily prejudiced against because of that. And that's something people are also, I'm seeing, trying to get people to remember is, yes, we unified, but it also was damaging to a lot of other groups that got lumped into this thing that all these terrorists are actually just similar and to other people that might be Muslim or from the region or have any kind of ties there. Because people are I saw people asking questions or saying things in their feeds that were like, so what do you like, telling somebody that maybe was a Muslim in the United States, like, so what do your parents think about this? And all these sort of like, are you happy about this? And like these people are like, of course not. You know what I mean? So I think that's important to forget about the prejudice that also came along with that too. So it's like, it was this unifying thing. And for most people it was, but there are always those marginalized groups in history that can also get forgotten. And this was one of those cases. But going back to this idea of, is the country, further divided more than it ever has been? Maybe that's the case. Will it take an event like that, 9/11, to unify a larger base of people, right? Probably always going to be a marginalized group. That's what we've seen in history. But unifying a large group of people, will that happen again? And if it does, is it going to require a tragedy? Right? These are some of the questions I think they're going to be interesting about 9/11. Now, 9/11 and the whole attacks on it has entered history curriculums. I mean, it's been in curriculums now for a long time. It did not take long before you started seeing it in new textbooks, especially as the years went on. I remember at first it was just like, these attacks happened, and then the United States got in wars involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. But then also bringing things, especially in my American history classes, started bringing things like the Patriot Act, which was kind of this, this idea that the government was able to amp up things that people might say are an invasion of privacy, right? With how they can spy on things. And I remember that entering the curriculum, which was an interesting thing because we had context of that, of similar things like that in other major American wars where you had the government able to amp up its monitoring of their own people, suspending certain rights and that sort of things during wartime. So it's been educational to teach about that, the responses like the government took to these attacks, and put it into context of similar things like this have happened in the past. And it brings into discussion about that, or can civil rights and things like that be suspended or changed during times of war to help a war effort. Usually brings in a pretty lively discussion, and those discussions, they still happen. right? Especially now, and we're increasing our involvement in the information age, which is what we're in, where there's so many media outlets and so much information that gets spread. A lot more even than 2001. We still have the internet, but it's even more in the information age. So information gets spread all over the place, and people still don't really know, it seems like, what to do with it. Anyway, that is just kind of my basic thoughts about what it was like for me as a teenager when the 9/11 attacks happened, and then being able to tell you guys as a teacher kind of how that has been framed. In my world history class, by the way, the final unit in most curriculums right now often is global terrorism, and it's very much a response to that. So that is, in a way, how history teachers are now getting involved with things, from reactive to the 9/11 attacks, because of this the whole idea of modern terrorism, again, is into curriculum. So anyways, I thought you might like to hear that from a teacher's perspective of how it looks now, how it's taught now, or how it's it's entered the curriculum, but then also give you my experience as somebody young and what my thought process was like. Anyway, didn't want to make this very political, and I don't think I did, but I thought you guys might like to hear what I thought. All right, and with that, again, you guys take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Bye.